Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to do a quick rundown of all the different options when we are sieging from the ground as a starter, and then later on we will move on to the wall defense options. So starting here, this is the siege camp that you can buy your parts from the armory when you're inside the siege camp during a war. And there are four main items that you want to pay attention to here. So starting in the top left corner, we have the ammunition kit. Now, the ammunition kit is a very important bread and butter of the siege operations because it is going to be the thing that allows you to rearm all of your siege weaponry during the attack. So it's very important, and you're most likely going to need to pick up a good few of these throughout the siege. And another thing we want to point out before going on is all these things need to be bought with battle tokens. The battle tokens are earned during the siege by attacking and killing and doing damage to the enemy siege and destroying it, basically. So things like kills and destroying siege will get you points. You might find situations where you're out of points and you might need to ask other people in your team to either buy you something from the shop or discuss it with your current leadership of the war, and they might be able to have some of the forces on the ground be able to make some purchases for you if necessary. So moving on, the second thing here is in the top middle we have the fire launcher platform. Now, the fire launcher platform is a siege weapon that is going to do AoE tick damage that you have to fire in a similar way to the cannonball, which we'll get to later, but you have to arc it onto the target location. Now, this is ideal for assisting with a push onto an objective, whether it's one of the three external zones or whether it's the final push into the middle. But the downsides is that it's not ideal for killing people. It's more of a large AoE damage that will help others get the kills. And it's very slow to rearm, and it is very slow and sluggish to aim and fire. Now, it is obviously, like I explained, it's good for making a push onto a zone, but that is pretty much its only use. You won't find this useful against the enemy siege, and it's pretty much best to only be used in those situations. Moving on to the next weapon is the cannon platform tier 1. These tiers will be different depending on once you upgrade them in battle. You can use a thing called siege parts, which we'll get to after this as well. So the cannon is the very main staple for the start of most sieges. You're going to be using these as an anti-siege weaponry. Now, there is a very big difference between the ground cannons and the wall cannons. That being that the ground cannons are very good for taking out enemy siege, but they only do single target damage, but they do high single target damage. So whereas with the wall cannons, which are explosive cannons, you might be able to fire one of them onto a zone when it's being pushed and do a lot of damage to a group of people. These ground ones are obviously very only specifically useful for attacking or using in anti-siege situations. So you want to be using these at the start of a siege to take down the enemy turrets. They, like I explained earlier, they have an arc just like the fire launcher. They reload a bit faster and they have more range. These are obviously need to be used when attacking at the start of a siege to take out the enemy siege units, but once that job is done, they won't serve much of a purpose after that, as they're not effective against groups of enemies or anything. So you want to be using these to get rid of the cannons on the walls, and then you want to be replacing them once that job is done. Moving on to the final thing that we want to pay attention to on this shop window here is the repeater platform. Now this is probably the best of the siege units at the moment, as it's not ideal for taking out enemy siege, but with a lot of these shooting at one cannon or one repeater on the wall, it can chunk damage quite effectively. But the main use of the repeater is actually shredding apart the enemy forces. Now, this can be anyone on the wall, this can be anyone sat on enemy siege turrets. You can actually use them to take out the people, and it does very high damage, even against high level enemies. So you want to be using these, especially when you're trying to do zone pushes. The repeater platform is very strong against players, like I just mentioned, and it is a single target damage, so it doesn't have the advantage of being able to hit multiple people at the same time, but obviously it makes up for that in the amount of damage it does, and the fact that it's a point and shoot weapon. You do not have to rely on arcing and testing to find where the angle of trajectory is when firing to try and hit something. The only time you might need to worry about aiming this more efficiently is if you're trying to, say, shoot at someone who's running in a line. You might need to aim just ahead of the target, and it's not too hard to get used to, but this thing is very much a rapid fire musket and can be used to quite literally snipe people, so much so that in the recent patch notes they actually change the repeaters to have a shorter drop off on damage because of how effective they are. Okay, so for this next section we are going to just take a quick look at each of the ground cannons or turrets, and I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of how each of them works and try to explain it as it happens. So at the start here, you can see the first turret that I use and is very recommended is that you start with the cannon platform. Now this is going to be used for, like I explained earlier, taking out the enemy siege at the start of a fight. This is extremely important and something to note because during a siege, the attacking force can buy as many siege turrets as they want, as long as they have the tokens to do so, whereas the defending force can only use the turrets that they have placed before a war starts. Now, what I mean by this is if you destroy an enemy siege turret on the wall, they then cannot rebuild or replace that for the remainder of the fight. They can only repair during a fight, which is why it is vital if you are in a defending position to use the repair parts, which we will again get onto later, to keep the health of your turrets up. So this is why using the cannons at the start of the fight is very vital to take down the enemy placements, because again, once they're gone, they are gone. Now, as you can see with the cannon, it does take a little bit of aiming to get used to. It might take you a couple practice shots just to get your aim in, but typically you want to aim high on the enemy placement depending on how far away you are. A good way to start testing is usually to line up the tip of the cannon barrel with the enemy siege unit on the wall and go from there. It might be a bit up or a bit down, like I said, depending on how far you are. But once you have taken out all of the enemy wall siege turrets as you can, or ideally all of them, then you can move on to the next one, which is going to be the repeater. So moving on, the repeater is, like I said, the very staple, most used siege turret that you are going to make use of during the ground attack. Now, the repeater is very good against single target damage. As you can see, it's a hit scan weapon, meaning you want to basically just aim and shoot. There is no travel time as far as I can tell, but the only other situation where this might be different is leading shots. If someone is running, you will need to aim slightly ahead of your target if you are trying to hit someone who is running, side to side or something. But for the most part, you do just want to very literally aim and shoot with this weapon. As I said earlier, this can be very useful for destroying anyone on a point, or taking out those pesky muskets on the wall, or even if there's someone using a siege weapon and maybe your cannons aren't reacting fast enough to take them out, then you can assist the cannons on a repeater by shooting at the person on the cannon. So moving on, our third and final weapon to be showing off on the ground siege is the fire launcher. Now, the fire launcher, as I explained earlier, again, is only really viable in a couple situations, and that is when AoE is going to assist you. You want to be using this weapon when trying to attack a point, or whether that be one of the 3 external ones that you have to capture at the start of the fight, or the one inside the fort closer to the end of the siege. Now, it does good AoE tick damage, but as I explained earlier, it is not ideal for killing enemies, but is very good support for lowering their health, so other people or other siege can take them out. They are undervalued and are very strong and can be utilised very well as long as you've got people who know how to aim them. As I also explained, though, they are a bit sluggish to aim and try and shoot, so you need to aim a bit closer to you because they don't fire as far. And you need to make sure you land your shots on the zones. Defending siege while we are on the wall. Now, there are only 2 things you really need to pay attention to, and that is in the shop. The only thing you really want to be buying is ammunition kits. Now, as I explained earlier, those ammunition kits can be used to rearm the siege turrets on the wall, and obviously you can't fire them without them. There's not much else in the shop. I mean, if you really wanted to and you had the extra tokens, you could buy some potions, or if you had a musket, you could buy some Azoth bullets, but ideally you want to be saving your points for ammunition kits because you don't want any downtime where you're not able to fire a gun because you don't have any. Now, the other thing I will point out at this point is I will do a quick run over of the siege parts, because they have a much greater use during this part of the war than they did in the attacking part. So the siege parts, they spawn in at a certain rate throughout a battle. They're not infinite, but they will keep respawning, so you can get them as they respawn, but you kind of need to get them when they're there. And there's all the repair part, or all the siege parts that are in these workshops will be available to anyone to take. So when I say they're not infinite, they will infinitely respawn, but they'll obviously be spread between all your people, so you need to make sure that you're not taking all of them in one go, but perhaps taking enough for yourself and then leaving enough for the next person. So the reason they're so useful is that, as I explained earlier, the wall cannons, which you use when you're the defending force, can be broken and destroyed, and once that happens, you cannot rebuy them or repair them. It will be too late, and you'll then be without those placements for the remainder of the war. You can use these repair parts by walking up to one of the turrets, and each of the turrets that you go up to, this is including the ones on the ground, as you can also do this with them, you press T to open a drop down menu when the pop-up shows, and it will give you the option to repair. You just need to click that button and stand still, and it will start using the parts to repair the turret. The other use of these is when you are on the ground siege, you can actually use these to upgrade the tier of the turret placement that you are using. This is what I mentioned earlier about how when you're in the shop at the start of the attack, it says tier 1 for the different placements. The amount of parts it takes to upgrade will change depending on what level the actual turret is. I'm not sure all the numbers off the top of my head, but I think the repeaters cost about 100 siege parts to upgrade to a tier 2, and that just means it does more damage. And a very important thing to point out is actually when you upgrade a turret, it rearms it, so it fills the ammo again. So if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have an ammo pack, but you have enough parts to upgrade a placement, then you can do that and it will not only upgrade it, but give you the ammo pack. So moving on now, we'll take a look at all of the main defense siege placements. We are not making use of all of the ones in this fight, as there are a couple which I'll mention which aren't really that useful or we haven't got around to trying, but the main 3 that we have in this fight are going to be the explosive cannons, the repeaters, and the horns. So starting off with the cannons, these are similar to the ground when you're attacking from the ground. They are high damage, anti-siege weaponry, but with the added bonus that when you're using the wall cannons, they do explosive AoE damage. The trade-off for this is that there is only about half as much ammo in a wall cannon as there is in a ground cannon. So yes, they get the added benefit of being able to help push back, push on a zone because of the AoE damage it provides, but you're going to have to rearm it more. So you want to be using it on people when you're desperate and you want to leave shooting the actual players with the repeaters if you can. The cannons obviously are going to be mainly used for taking out the enemy siege, but they do have travel time and you have to arc the shots. So the second one we have here is again the repeater. Like I said, same as ground force, this is going to be a main use on the walls as it is very good for taking out enemy players, and it can be good for sniping people out of the enemy turrets, and if you are desperate they can also deliver a good amount of damage to enemy siege placements. So there's not really a time where you can't use these, but there are times when some of the others may be better to use. The third and final thing that we're going to talk about in this one is the resilience horns. Now, they take up turret spots, but they don't actually work as turrets. They are a horn which, when you run up to and you sound, it gives a 10-second buff to the area around the horn, which usually will cover the capture points outside of the walls if it's on the side of the capture point. And this resilience buff is very useful because it gives a lot of defense to the ground force, which means if they are getting pushed, they are much harder to kill, giving them a better chance of withstanding the attack and giving time for the siege to push back the invading force. It's again something that is very undervalued and people don't make use of. Make sure if you've got horns that are up, when there are points where they could be utilized to stave off an attack, make sure you're using them because they can change the course of an attack and potentially save a zone. Just a quick thing to add, we will just give a quick talk about the other 2 options that are on the wall siege but we have not utilised up until this point. There is the oil vats, which are essentially similar to the horn but they are placed above gates and are used to basically, as the name suggests, drop a vat of oil onto the ground, dealing AoE damage. It's not aimable, it only does it in front of the gate, so the uses of this are very limited when either the enemies are trying to push through a choke point or their melee soldiers are trying to destroy the gates. This is why they are not worth the turret spot unless there is some major change to them. I can't see them really being worth the spot over something like a repeater. The other one is the ballistas, which we have not got around to testing, but from what we can gather, they are essentially a single damage, high damage anti-siege weaponry, which is similar to the, well, it's a mix between the cannons and the repeaters in the sense that it's a point and shoot, but it doesn't, you don't have to arc it. It's more of just a, you know, it's a high damage and you just aim where you want to shoot it. Obviously, we have not had the chance to test these, so we're not fully 100% on how useful they are, but what we have found is that relying on the cannons and repeaters is good enough in most situations. Okay guys, so that is the end of this explanation of how all the siege works in the wars. So hopefully this has been useful. I really hope you guys can basically watch through this, and if you have any other questions because I maybe didn't explain something brilliantly, then let me know. I'll do my best to answer them, but hopefully from this you'll be able to piece together how to basically organize a siege during a war, and good luck to you. I hope the wars go in your favor going forwards.
We've got this, lads. Well done, everyone. I think we've got this.
On 2 seconds, start dancing.
Okay, start dancing, guys. It's okay.
Siege team, get off the cannons and dance. Siege team, get off and dance.
That's a win, that's a win. We can all literally stop.
GG.
GG's.
GG, boys. Yes.
Excellent work, guys.
Great
Well
defense.
that structure works really well as well with the call outs.
Yeah,
That is
brilliant
how you do
calls.
defense. Well done,
15,000 XP, what the fuck?
I got
Nice.
12k.
Holy shit, that experience.
crew. Nice. Well
True.
done, everyone.
Party at Everfall pub to celebrate?
Yeah.
Or PvP training wins with?